Good morning, and mabuhay from the Philippines. My name is Raju Mandhyan. I'm a speaker, trainer, and a coach based in the Philippines. So this morning, for day one, I want to share with you how I came about with the title The Sage and the Guide. Several weeks ago, when I decided to start a podcast, some of the thoughts that went through my mind were like, what impact will my podcast have in a podcast crowded world? How will my podcast be outstandingly different from all other podcasts that are in the cyberspace? And what kind of value and service will it create for the listener? I wasn't getting very good answers for these questions on my mind, so I called up a friend of mine in Texas. He is silver-haired and silver-whiskered like myself, and he's a chronic and a certified community builder. In fact, he's so good at community building that Facebook pulled him out of retirement and made him their employee. He's also a very successful podcaster, and he has a podcast called A House of Donuts. And the reason he calls it the House of Donuts is because he loves sugar and donuts. So I raise my questions, and Hal goes, his name is Hal Blevis, and Hal goes, Raju, you don't have to worry about impacting the whole world. Just focus on one single human being, and if your podcast reaches out and touches another human being, that should be enough. Then he said, your podcast doesn't have to be strikingly different. It will grow and evolve into being strikingly different and unique. Just let it be you. And the last thing he suggested is, Raju, have fun and keep it simple. Don't make it complicated. His ideas made sense, and his earnestness was very convincing. So after that, I still went to another global guru, Google. And I asked Google, should I talk about how to be happy? And Google responded and said it had 104 million answers to that question. Ooh. Then I asked Google, should I talk about how to be successful in life and at work? And Google claimed it had 80 million answers for a question like that. How about health building and wealth building, Mr. Google? And Google says I have 20 million answers for each one of those questions. So I was a bit stumped, and I began to wonder about all those people who have created great content, the thought leaders and the philosophers and the sages and the guides of the past. And I was wondering how their content is still useful and relevant and serves humanity until now. What did they do differently? Then a story came up in my mind, a story that I'd heard somewhere about the Chinese philosopher and poet Confucius. It is said that when Confucius was at his deathbed, his followers asked of him, they said, Master, if you were to live your life all over again, what would you do differently? And the master paused, then he smiled and he said, I have these books, thousands of them in my library, and I have studied all those philosophies. I have probably practiced many of them. But today, as my life is coming to an end, I'm thinking, had I chosen just one book, had I chosen just one philosophy and a single set of practices, my life would have been just fine. I would have been equally happy, equally healthy, and equally wise, just as I am now. Life is simple, and we make it complicated, claimed Confucius, the philosopher and the sage. Now, that story influenced my thinking. It has stuck to my mind. And so I wanted to create. So I'm creating a podcast that will have a singular focus, a focus that is along the lines of my passion. I am passionate about how leaders speak, how leaders think, and how leaders act. It is about public speaking and leadership and creativity, and how leaders are authentic and how do they influence their followers and their world. So I came up with this title, The Sage and the Guide. The Sage and the Guide, because those leaders, those powerful, effective, and magical leaders, they sometimes have to be a sage on stage, and many times they have to be a guide by the side of their people. Thus, the podcast, The Sage and the Guide, which will focus upon public speaking and leadership and how to be authentic in that area and how to influence your world effectively and massively. So there you go. That's the story behind the title and the podcast, The Sage and the Guide. Now, I thank you for listening in to me up until now, and I hope you found this little meandering interesting. And I'd like your support. My fervent prayer and request to you is that you listen into my podcast and support me with your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, such that we create a singular focus towards leaders of the world being a sage and being a guide. There you go. Thank you. My name is Raju Mandhyan. I'm a speaker, trainer, coach based in the Philippines, and I aim to do 2, maybe 4 podcasts a month. Again, one more time, thank you and mabuhay.